And do a quick overview of what our kind of goal for today is. I want to talk about what is building in general, how can we use real world influences to do that, and then, like I said, we'll have a couple of interactive sections to kind of talk about how you can world build yourself, and we'll be kind of building a nation together. Start thinking of some ideas for what you might want to come up with. No pressure on this being the most amazing thing ever. It's just kind of a fun activity to get our creativity flowing, because even if you're not going to use this later on, if you want to write, you want to do any type of creativity, you need to be able to, flex the creative muscles. And feel free to ask me questions throughout the presentation, whether you're on Zoom or here. I am always happy to take questions. Great. So what is world building? World building, in a really simple sense of the world, is building a world. There is anything from magic, people, clothing, technology, magic, aesthetics, anything you could really imagine. That all goes into world building. So it's a very big topic to cover in an hour here, but I'll do my best. So what we have here on the presentation slide is some of the world building elements that are in my series, particularly the Realm Reacher series. Just as examples, we'll go into some more specifics later on, but world building can be anything from landscapes and kind of magic with that, the cities that you see and what the type of architecture that comes around with that. I'm a big flag nerd, so I make flags for all my nations and stuff like that, which is also inspired from the real world. Maps, things like what type of warfare do they do? Do they have cavalry? Do they have more modern technology? And then what do people wear? And that all things kind of comes together for world building. And so world building is a really, really big topic. And a big thing with world building is you're never really done with it. It's a process. When we start writing our stories, one of the first things we tend to do is world build. Where is my story taking place? Who are the people in it? And what are they going to do within this world? Because you can't really know the plot until you know where the people are. And so some elements of that you might be able to write ahead of time. And you might be able to have it established ahead of time. But while you're writing the story, you'll also inherently discover that you need to develop things further. The story needs to have this element of the world or things like that. So it's always an ongoing process. And first drafts while we're building our world are for us as creators, as authors, or whatever type of thing you're creating. And so it is okay to change things, create world, say, that's not working, actually, I need to go back and change things otherwise. And when we do our research, we take research from both things we love to read or watch or stuff like that, but you also take from real world elements, like I've taken from my heritage, but you can take from history, you can take from mythology, you can take to even modern day events. What is happening around us in the world, and what could we use to inspire our aspects? I'll talk about a little bit later how that inspired some aspects specifically of my books. A big thing as well, a last thing I'll say on this slide is that worlds are not static. You can see that I have some very different aesthetics throughout some of these things, because where you are in the world, things change. The worlds also change over time. If a decade passes in your book, I wouldn't expect everything to be the exact same. Things in 2005 did not look the same as 2015 or the same as 2025. So it's good to think about all these elements when we're world building. And so a lot goes into that. But world building is also a trap, because a lot of people, whether you're a dungeon master playing D&D or a author who just loves fantasy books and wants to build their world, we often get caught in the stage of world building because there is so much to it, and we almost think that we need every element already created before we start writing. That's not true. You do not need all of it written down. There's a couple different methods of writing. That's a whole different conversation, but whether you're what we call a pantser, where you're flying by the seat of your pants while you write, or the architect, where you really have the whole world built ahead of time, you can have different aspects of it, and you don't want to spend your whole time world building because you'll never get to writing. The Titanic is a great influence for this because of iceberg theory. Don't hit the iceberg, but you want to know about iceberg theory, which is, does anyone here heard of iceberg theory before? Great. So iceberg theory is the theory that up here on the top is the actual words that you write on the page. And everything beneath here is everything else that you haven't actually written on the page, but is implied that it exists. It means that there's a lot that we could want to write, like things like are listed here: themes, societal issues, profound questions, character fears. All of these things can be all in there, but if you put so much in it, it really over deepens the book, and you end up getting caught up in that trap where you've put too much world building in. Because as authors or creators of any kind, we have like a certain number of coins when we're working with a reader. You spend a coin every time you introduce something unusual to them that takes them a moment to think about and kind of maybe takes them out of the story for a second because they need to contemplate. And so what we want to do is we want to make the iceberg enough where you can see everything above and they can see the iceberg is there, and you can apply everything else beneath there, but you don't actually have to build anything in the bottom part of the everything underwater. You don't need to either have it built, or even if you have it built, you don't need to list it, because you start doing that, it sinks things down and you run into the iceberg. But it's important to have enough depth above the iceberg with your world building to ensure that you're not to ensure that people know that the iceberg is there and your thing doesn't fall apart into an unbelievable mess. So it is a balance when you're doing this world building. It's a lot of fun, but it's also not immersive if you don't add enough into it. So like I said, with my world building elements, I love to have little elements outside of the story, whether it's maps, newspaper articles, things like that in the story that allow people to connect to other parts of the world. But if you're actually not interested in that, it's kind of separate, so people can just keep reading if they want to. It allows people to decide how much of that they want and how much they want to have it above, because different readers are going to pick up on other things as well. Some people are much more perceptive than others, which is okay. All right, so I'm going to start off our first interactive element of the day. This is an easy one, so I want to start you off at a really simple point. Think of a name of your nation that we're going to build together today. This does not have to be the perfect name. You can change it another time, but just think about the world as that we have and how are countries named in reality. I'll go over a quick example of some of the nations that I've put in mind and how I came up with it. One of them is called the Commonwealth of Two Nations, which is inspired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Two nations, one Commonwealth. Another one is just called Knockland because it is inspired by kind of the Netherlands. But a trap here is make sure you don't put every country having land at the end, because if you think about actual countries, most countries don't actually have land at the end. You got like Greenland, Netherlands. I can't even think of too many more off the top of my head, because you got like Germany, Russia, United States, all things that don't have land at the end. You can think of what would the history of your world be? What would the history of this nation be? And maybe, is it a kingdom? Is it a republic? Things like that. You don't have to have all that depth right now, but just jot something down. Give us a little bit of a seed to think about. You can always change it later. So I will give everyone a moment to think about that without me rambling, and then we can move on. And I will have some inclusion where I ask you guys what you've written down a little bit later. This one's simple enough that I'll leave it for this one, but so I'll just wait for everyone to give me a moment. Give me a thumbs up when you're done. You good? Great, all good. If you're on chat too, I'm going too quick, feel free to drop in the chat that you need more time. And so while we go through this, let's look at, we've got the start of our nation here. Let's think of some real world inspirations in major books and shows that we all kind of know, and kind of think of how those inspirations show up in stories, and then how can we use that as inspiration for our own. Big one, Game of Thrones. We all know Game of Thrones, or if you don't, you've heard of it probably. It is very classically, clearly high Middle Ages. It's got castles and armor and people on horses and technology that's not super modern, but it somehow manages to be very unique while taking one of the most overdone eras of history and bringing it into its own. It takes real world inspiration, not just generally from the High Middle Ages. It takes inspirations particularly from the British War of the Roses, which was a civil war that took place during the British Middle Ages. You can actually see some of that inspiration when you look at the map of Westeros here. You see how it's split up, and then you see how Westeros looks as an island is actually incredibly similar to how Great Britain looks. There's even the islands out here that resemble Ireland, and the landmass to the east. He takes a lot of inspiration from Britain, and that's okay. There are similar authors that do a similar thing. And you think about the War of the Roses and how it was a war focused on an internal divide more than an external divide. And this is something to think about when we're world building as well. Think about our nation. We think about how things work in the world. And it's not all us versus them. You think about our own country. There are divides in our own nation, right? You've got Democrats, you got Republicans, you got the Midwest, you got the Northeast, you got the South, a little bit of different regions, and it gives people different opinions. No nation is a blank slate in its own or uniform in its own. And I think Game of Thrones gives us a perfect example of that, as all of the kingdoms in Game of Thrones are technically part of the same nation, right? You've got the difference of the North is very, very different than the Crown lands because of both geography, weather, how their culture is based on, but they still are the same country technically as the Crown lands and groups like the Lannisters versus the Starks. And this shows up as well in clothing, which is going to be one of the main things we start thinking about next for our nation. Because clothing can tell you a lot about a people. You look at Jon Snow here, dressed in furs, black leathers, pretty heavy garb, because the North is cold. It requires much more warmth. It also gives you the feeling of what do these people value and how much money do they have, aspects like that. The North doesn't have a lot of heavy armor that shows up in it because armor is very expensive. You see Jaime Lannister shows up in very, very shiny armor that actually would probably be fairly useless because the armor was more decorative. Shows that the Crown lands and the Lannister family had a lot of money, and they were focusing more on displaying that power more than they were focusing on actually being able to fight. While the Northmen needed to be in effective leathers to hold off often the people are invading from the north or often fighting among themselves. And this is a thing that relates, again, inspiration from the real world as well. If you ever go to a history museum, it's really fun to look at king armor from the Middle Ages. A lot of times the kings had their fancy armor that they wore into battle, and it almost never was ever chipped or anything like that. It was not meant to ever actually take a hit. It was meant to be fancy. It was meant to be a display of power. And we have to think of clothing has a huge way of displaying who we are. Think about when you got dressed this morning. You are trying to think, when I'm putting on a shirt, I'm putting on my pants, putting on whatever, are you trying to be impressive? Are you trying to blend in with everyone around you? Are you trying to make a statement? Are you not trying to make a statement? These are all things that have to come for your characters as well. Putting them in a suit in like the modern times, it comes into world building because that's saying that this character and the society value a suit as a formal thing of power. But if you put them in casual attire, it can mean the opposite. And so that becomes an interesting element as well if you think about how characters change based on the situation they're in. Daenerys Targaryen, for example, is one of the most impactful, most recognizable characters in fantasy. And she changes significantly throughout the series. You show her trying to blend in with the many cultures that she sees throughout the show. And this happens, I think, if you think about people that immigrate from other countries, you have one culture, you wear a certain thing, you move to another culture, they wear other things. It takes time to integrate. And she tries to blend in through sometimes and then tries to stand out other times. You see her in this fancy dress on the far right. That is her trying to connect to the kind of independent cities of Essos, which is not trying to display necessarily military power, but it's trying to show like an authority of I'm a queenly figure, I'm diplomatic, I want to work with you as allies. But then you show her once she's invaded Westeros, she's wearing this very military dark garb, chains. She's wearing, she inherits some of the culture of the Dothraki to braid her hair one braid for every victory. And it shows how the characters can inherit some of these different things from cultures and make them into their own and make them unique, because characters are part of their cultures. And just like we were saying with the nations, they are not all consumed by that as well. And lastly, on Game of Thrones, I won't talk too much about Game of Thrones because I could go on forever about it, but because there's amazing world building. But the sigils we see in the lower left are also inspired by real world. If you look back into history, all these great houses in the history would have had a different sigil that represented what they valued among their people. And the same thing happens among the great houses of Westeros. You've got the Starks. They've got the direwolf, which is a big symbol and representation of their influence in the north, where direwolves are common. Then you have the Targaryens on the opposite end, who were a southern group that focused on dragons as their power. So the dragon is their symbol. So you can think about, if you want to use symbols in your world, what kind of symbols will represent influence in their world? Do they want to show off as power? Do they want to show off as diplomatic? Because a dragon is not very diplomatic, but it shows an element of fear, or trying to influence through fear. Great. So now we're going to move on to our second interaction. One big thing you might actually hear me talk about too much with Game of Thrones is that there's not actually that much magic in Game of Thrones, but dragons, right? But a big thing that influences is how that lack of magic interacts with the little bit of magic that shows up in the show. And so we can think about when we're doing and creating our world, whether we want magic at all. I always say, try to include some because it's cool. And little doses of magic make a really big difference to a story. But magic and science can be two ends of the same coin, sides of the same coin. You think about our own history and how we relate to our inspirations from it. Science for so long was often considered kind of a magic. You think of alchemy, you think about people being burned at the stake for having opinions or discovering things that actually were just what we realize as science today. A lot of witchy herbal medicines back in the day were actually science things that are now pills and things like that. And so when we think about this, there's a lot of layers to a magic system. And when we might be able to get into everything when we work on this, but think about, do you want a magic to be, think about like reliance on a object? Do you want it to be inherent to a person? Do you want it to have to be a communal ritual-like activity? How would you like your magic to exist? Or if you want magic at all? And how does that relate to both the science level of it, like if you're having a futuristic world, a Victorian era, 1800s flintlock guns type, American Revolution era, or do you want older? Do you want medieval, or even further back, Dark Ages? So if you want to start at least jotting down some notes about that, what era you want it to be in with a little bit of technology level, what kind of magic, at least in a base, that you're thinking about, and whether the magic is going to relate to the technology or counteract it as well. And then think about religion, how religion plays into that as well. Historically, religion and technology and magic have had a complicated relationship. Think about the Inquisition. Think about how, for a long time, discoveries of the sun and aspects like that were, how the revolution around the sun was counteracted by the church and then accepted by it. How do all these things work together in your world? And how are things like, how can you use inspirations from things like the folk tales? And do you want to use darker versions like the Grimm Bros? Or do you want to use lighter versions like Disney? Which both have the same story, but they show whether you can take a more positive spin on things or a little bit more negative spin on things. And these are all inspirations that can go into world building elements. So just right now, think about some of those little elements of your magic. How do you want to work? This doesn't need to be fully in depth, but just kind of give you a little bit of thought about it. And while you write those down, I'll tell you a little bit about the magic I have in my own books, maybe for some inspiration. So I have 2 series that really integrate magic. The Realm Reachers is inspired by a mix of Dungeons and Dragons magic, if you know anything about that, with my own systems as well. So I have it where there is a specific types of crystal that allow the people in the world to reach into other realms and pull magic out of it in exchange for a cost from themselves. That can be anything from fire. You are locked into a specific type of magic. So it can be anything from fire magic to water magic to being able to manipulate people's minds and things like that. And so it ends up as a little bit of a harder magic system compared to a softer one. Just a little bit more rigid rules versus a little bit more of like your basic elemental type magic system where things are a little bit softer. Another thing that's big in my world as well is that it is inhabited by spirits. They can only be killed with glass, which is not in itself a magic, but affects the science and technological advancements because you become reliant on certain things for your scientific levels. And that involves people literally building glass houses and things like that to protect against the dangerous spirits of the realm. My other series is the Frostmarked Chronicles, the Slavic mythology series. That one draws a little bit more from witchcraft and historic Slavic mythology and how magic was done, and that was always related to nature. So every types of magic is related to what you would think of. If you think of like Greek mythology, in a lot of ways it's similar. Things are related to either like gods of water or like the equivalent of like Thor is Perun. So there's thunder magic and aspects like that allow them to have a more intrinsic natural like magic system to it. But it relies on people's connection to the gods instead of where in the realm reachers, it's more how they draw directly from the other realms, which doesn't rely on a relational type of thing of magic. So before I go any further, does anyone want to share any aspects of the magic system that they've thought of? You can share it in the chat as well as any people here. You looked eager. Do you want to share?
Still actually writing.
That's okay. Does anyone else have any things they would like to share? It's okay. Any in the chat? If not, I will give everyone a few minutes to continue working. A military stick nation. Militaristic. Yes, that's a military stick nation could be fun too, but a militaristic nation. Yeah. Oh, so yeah. So Katie says that it's a militaristic nation. The magic is based on the elite and it is not widespread, which is a great start. That's actually something I should mention, is that a big thing to think about in magic is if it is widespread, there needs to be, especially if it's widespread, there needs to be limits to it because magic can become overpowered incredibly quickly. And if everyone had magic that didn't have any limits, if you look at the world and you think about some of the people around you, what they would do with unlimited power, it would end badly really quickly. And so there usually needs to be some limits to your magic. And having the elite control magic tends to be a thing in fantasy because if you have this powerful element, it's inherently going to make you more of an influential person than others. And I'll discuss this actually a little bit later, but that's relevant to my Realm Breachers series because you've got the powerful people called the Scions are the only ones that are able to do the realm reaching and able to do the magic while the lowborn cannot. And so they're largely like the two popular approaches, while there's many other ones, is that you either have a small group of people that control the magic and they tend to be in charge, or you have a small group of people that can do the magic and everyone hates them and they're exiled, which are two very popular tropes. Or you have ones that they end up as like a monastic order, like in the Jedi, but I'll discuss them later. Are there any other people who want to drop anything in the chat? Yeah, go ahead.
I've been just playing around with
That's awesome. You're getting ahead too of the geography, but that's perfect. So for the people in the chat, I don't know if you heard Larissa, but she was saying that she has a world that is going to be a little bit more kind of built into the cliff sides, and she has wind. And you said the magic was related to the wind and weather. that which is a really powerful thing because you're already thinking about how does the geography affect my magic? Has that been crafted by the people that there was this kind of erosion, or was that a natural element that they're now controlling? And these are all things to kind of think of.
Very isolated from whatever else is happening.
Okay, yeah.
Or they get attacked.
Yeah, that's a big thing too. Yeah, world building, magic is like any other technology where we develop it when we think about a lot of human developments have come from a necessity for survival. So yes, if they need a defense against other people, maybe they specifically settled in that cliff area because it is defensive and they were outnumbered or something like that, or they were pushed there. So these are all things you can think about when you're building your world because it's all inherently connected. I'm kind of going one thing at a time here to allow it to be a little bit more approachable. But there are so many interconnected elements. That is why it's a lot of fun to world build. It's because one thing changes something else, which can change something else, and it leads to spiraling depths of really cool stuff. So that's a great idea. You got a good start, and honestly, that's going to be a fun connection to one thing I talk about later with the Stormlight Archive. If you've heard about that by Brandon Sanderson. All right, so next slide, we'll move into talking about Dune. Dune is it's technically sci-fi. I know it's not technically fantasy, but it has some of the best world building I think I've ever seen in a movie or a book. Because Dune really mixes sci-fi and fantasy elements, taking a futuristic setting, but in a way that feels very feudal. It has inspirations from the real world. When you think about you have a king or emperor and all these noble houses beneath it, and how they all dynamically interact. Despite this being a super futuristic setting, it shows that people kind of act the same throughout the ages, no matter how technology interacts. Religion, like we were just kind of talking about how religion can play in magic, religion plays a big role in Dune. How Paul is portrayed with the Ben Gesserit, drawing from elements in the real world when this book was being written, drawing from elements of Islam, Buddhism, and Sufism that kind of integrate into how Paul is portrayed, both potentially as a savior, but also potentially more as a negative element as well. You have like cult-like elements behind things. You have a more rigid political system, but you also have very, very different types of clothing, which is one thing I'd like to emphasize here as well. Because one of the things like I said, we're going to think about is clothing. You think about, the names of the rebels from Dune are escaping me. The Fremen. You think about the Fremen. They live in a world that is entirely desert. There is no water available, right? And so, or very little water available. So their entire clothing is based on wearing these suits that recycle water throughout your body and ensure none of it is wasted. Because to waste any of it would mean dying. So when we think of the clothes in our world, it can be as basic as what looks good. It could be as complicated as, well, they live in that complicated desert world that they would dehydrate really quickly without their suits. Then you look at the more advanced settlers and the nobility. They wear really interesting, almost metallic-like designs that are inspired by Middle Ages type attire, where you have people who are wearing things that are like fake armor, kind of like I said kings used to do back in the day, where it's more a display of wealth than it is actually any defensive ability in combat. You have dresses and stuff like that that also take the same kind of metallic like elements to it. It is all about display and a show of power, and that tells you about them. The big difference is the wealthy can show their power. They don't need their clothes to help them survive. The Fremen, who have nothing effectively and are trying to just survive in the desert, have to use every element they have to devote to their survival. And so you can think of that when you think of clothing, when you think of your magic system, you just think about where your characters are in the society. Do they want to be, or not, where are they in the society? Do they exist in that lower strata, and are they kind of scraping by for survival? Because that's going to affect what they wear and how they interact with the people around them. You also see things like the militaristic garb in Dune as well. it looks like a very modern military attire in a lot of ways, but it's very simple as well. That is less displayed. It's minimalistic, it's focused, and that also says something about a people as well. What do they honor is what we tend to wear in our formal attire tends to be what we honor as well. And lastly, one thing I want to talk about with Dune is the focus on resources. We'll talk about economics further on, but spice determines everything in Dune. It is the entire focus why this planet is relevant. The spice is used for space travel, and it's also used as part of the magic system. So that's one thing you can use is you have an element that is needed for one group for one thing, and then needed for another group for another reason. So you have the Fremen who almost religiously attach to the spice because they need it for their like visions and things like that. And then you have the settlers and the imperial people that are more focused on using it for their technology. So that becomes a fun element where you can have two people needing the same thing for different reasons, which allows natural conflict in a story instead of having to force the plot onto the world. And then the last thing on that is that they use spice for that space travel because Frank Herbert did an interesting thing of deciding to do the spice for space travel instead of focusing on computers or AI or things like that tend to be the focus of sci-fi. So it allows us to take different elements. And when we're taking inspirations from the real world, we don't have to rely entirely on it. You can take things that are in the real world. You can also say, what if that thing didn't exist? What if there wasn't computers for space travel and things like that? What if we had to rely on people hallucinating on spice, which sounds crazy, turned into one of the most successful movies ever. There we go. All right, so we move on to our next interactive. Thinking about things like Dune or Game of Thrones and aspects like that, let's then think about real world examples as well. And how can we relate this to the clothing of the people in our world? We're already thinking about some discussions about things like weather and the climate of our world. Is it super cold? They're going to need a lot of layers if so. Is it very windy? Do they need to protect their faces from you're on those cliffs? Do they have to protect their faces from debris or anything affecting them? Other things to think about are wealth level, technology, beauty, or function. Because again, no matter of wealth level, people try to wear things they find beautiful. But some people have to have some function compared to the beauty aspect. And then how does magic potentially relate to clothing as well? Like I said, in my world, the crystals become part of their clothing because when they touch the crystal and kind of get it built onto their hands, they have this talon that allows them, kind of looks like a claw-like thing, that allows them to reach into the other realms. But that actually becomes part of their clothing then, because that's a status symbol. So how can your magic potentially relate to that as well? I've got photos down here as well relating to different inspirations. You have the modern suit. You've got Renaissance attire. Two very formal things of the ages, but very different in different ways. Modern attire, a little bit more simplistic, a little bit more minimalistic. A lot of the older attire was very bombastic, trying to show a lot of things as well. You have different things from different cultures as well. African cultures, Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, all having different ways to display what they find important and what they find beautiful. And so these are all things we can think of when we take inspirations. Because the big thing is, don't just take inspirations from what we picture as European Middle Ages. There are so much of world history. That's why I do Polish stuff as my research, but even Eastern Europe rarely gets any focus. It's all Britain, France, Germany. There are so many beautiful interactions you can look at from across the world. And think of that when you think of your clothing for any of them. Does anyone have anything they want to share with clothing, or how it relates to magic or anything like that? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my world, I've taken a lot of fairy tales and kind of combined.
Perfect.
So my kingdom's name, I'm Polish like you.
Perfect.
My kingdom's name is Vincent, after Bobby Vinton,
okay.
singer.
Yep.
So in my world, it's like dark ages, and the main people are dwarves who their clothes are stuff that can get dirty, not very colorful because it's old, like mostly blacks, grays. The women are dressed in jewels and expensive stuff because they don't get dirty.
Yep.
And the dwarves have a small group of people living with them who are wizards, and they have all the magic. And the wizards wear little Red Riding Hoods. And this army, there's this other nation who is led by a big bad wolf, wants to come and attack the wizards and take their magic from them. And the dwarves are their only line of defense, but the dwarves' armor is mostly wood and stones and things that they find. So the dwarves and the wizards have to work together to defeat big bad wolves, whose clothing is mostly fur and have a lot more armor.
Nice.
That's what I got so far.
Well, that's very fun. I don't know. I'll repeat a little bit of that for the people on Zoom in case people didn't hear that. It sounds like we've got elements here combining Little Red Riding Hood with attacking wolves and wearing fur and kind of an aggressive culture. Then you have the defensive elements of the dwarves, right? And this is talking about what do the cultures value too. You might need to have armor because for survival, like you said, they got wood and stone and things like that. But that becomes a defensive element. The dwarves aren't looking to conquer necessarily; they're looking to defend. And what different cultures take will also appear both in their everyday attire, but in their military attire as well. Because if you'll see cultures that have developed siege weaponry or things like that, if they really want to advance, they'll have magic that's all assaulting. Then you can have magic or attire or things like that are focused on just survival, trying to hold off. And it's fun that you talk about two different nations or two different peoples connecting to try to work together, because nations, like I said, are not inherently one type of people. They're the United States. We're a diverse country. You think about even in fantasy worlds, you can have a country that is just one type of people, but there needs to be a reason for that because people have always migrated across borders. But you can also have focus on how do these groups work together? What is an advantage one group provides that the other group doesn't have? Think about the dwarves had these resources, but the wizards have magic, and they need to work together to survive. That's an excellent way to be able to put a plot together and saying, why do we need to work together? What is our disadvantage against these other guys? But what can you provide that I don't have as well? So thank you. That's a great little thing. And pulling from folktales is always fun because they've already given us some elements of why stories work. But they can also show us a way to be able to twist it in our own ways, which is always fun as well. Yes. That is an excellent question. I actually have a topic later on that, but I'll address it a little bit right now. So appropriation is a very difficult topic because everyone draws the line a little bit differently. I think one big thing is when you are talking about a culture, particularly the one that is not your own, you need to be very respectful, very careful. And we have these things called like beta readers and stuff like that. Always seek out people that are part of the culture if it still exists, or whatever can be the closest relation to it, and make sure that you get feedback to make sure you are addressing it in a respectful way, understanding it, and not just like copying it as well. Because especially in fantasy, if you're using real world fantasy, like some contemporary fantasy, you can obviously use the actual culture because it might be based in that actual country. But if you're doing it in your own world, what can you do to take it where you're using it as inspiration and influence and doing it as kind of a cool, respectful thing, and not necessarily just plopping Chinese culture on your fantasy world, because that becomes appropriation at that point, particularly if you aren't Chinese. I get away with a little bit more from the Slavic aspect of it because I'm 50% Polish, but I also realized I'm not Polish myself. I did 72 blog articles. You do not have to do this amount, but actually researching Slavic mythology, trying to translate some articles that weren't even in English into English to talk about some of these myths and introduce them to people in ways that they weren't before. Because my goal in a lot of that writing was to introduce people to stuff they didn't know about. So a big thing like that is read from people from the actual culture, see how they present it, and try to do it in an authentic way. It is always walking a difficult line, but my biggest recommendation before you publish anything is always get responses and feedback from the people of the culture you're talking about. Even if it's just have them read that couple pages where you talk about something. If it's minor, if it's major, have them read the whole book. So hopefully that helps with that. Do we have any other questions while we're in the stopping period in the chat or in here? Great. Keep on moving. Checking time real quick. Okay. So I'll talk real quick on some of the talks about things that I focus on in my books with the inspirations. Realm Reachers, I take inspiration from the Victorian era along with the Polish inspirations. So one thing that was really popular in that era was high collars and kind of like pop collars along with cravats and things like that. And I overemphasize that where I have them like really high collars and aspects like that because I wanted to like play it up as aspects. And then I worked it into a magic system with a hidden thing, spoilers for my series, but like collarbones become some related to how some elements of the magic were related. And so people were covering the collarbone historically because they were trying to hide the fact they had magic. And it just carried on even though that went away. And so that could be an interesting thing about, you think about culture. Magic or what we wear doesn't sometimes isn't even relevant anymore, but we just carried on what was traditional historically. You talked about, was it you were talking about the clothing? You were wearing the dwarves of your world were wearing dull, tattered clothing. Same thing I do with my lowborn. People, I mean, traditionally in history, people who are wearing colorful clothing, it's more expensive. Dyes tend to be incredibly expensive. The entire thing, if you think about history of the Byzantine Empire, which was Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of Rome, was so focused on purple because purple was the hardest and most expensive dye to get. And so that's things about economics, but also shows their royalty became so focused on a particular color. And you can show them that that color becomes a major thing. For me, it becomes the crimson because the crimsons are one of the major factions in my world. So what people are wearing cannot just show wealth, it can show affiliation with a certain faction or group of people or things like that. And I have rebels wearing tattered clothes with just like a brightly colored yellow armband, which also shows their affiliation, but they can't afford more than that color-wise. And then weaponry, I wanted to, though, I had the Victorian era stuff. I wanted to include some aspects of cool swords because I'm a fantasy nerd. We like cool swords, right? And so I kept glass armor and glass swords as that aspect I talked about earlier, where they can fight spirits with that. But glass bullets would be very expensive, very fragile, things like that. So it allows it to say, okay, well, we have to use older technology aspects with glass swords and armor instead of anything like that. But then those glass elements actually then get woven into the highborn cloaks and aspects like that that stop them from being attacked. So that allows the magic to be woven into the how things are working with the clothing, as well as just making it look cool, because sometimes aesthetics is just as fun as actual usefulness. Frostmarked Chronicles, I'll just talk quickly about this. Slavic embroidery is a big thing in tribal history, and now also today among Slavs. Slavic people is a lot of the Eastern European people, including Poland, Ukraine, Russia, stuff like that. And so we implemented that in a lot of the attire, like ribbons, amulets, agricultural focused weaponry. And then because there's less tech in the Dark Ages, or which is the Slavic mythology stuff was inspired on, you have cloaks, leather boots, wood, things like you were talking about, where it's much simpler with the culture and technology than you have with the Victorian era, because inherently the tech is different. All right. Stormwood Archive is another one I could talk forever about, but I will just cover, I think I'm going to focus on the geography aspect of this, because that's what we're going to talk about next. The Stormwood Archive, I mentioned earlier because Larissa, you were talking about the windswept world and kind of aspects, is the Stormwood Archive has a brilliant world building system where there's a massive storm every now and then that comes through the entire planet, and is incredibly destructive and like wind swipes the entire terrain. There's like fractured plains and aspects like that because of it. And that weather and that geography really shapes the population, because you have to then live on the west side of mountains, because if you're on the east side, you're going to get wiped out by the high storm. If you are, that storm also carries the magic. So they would place these orbs out when the storm comes around to be able to fill the orbs with the magic. So while you're also trying to be protected from the storm, you need to be exposed to it enough to be able to place the magic orbs out to be able to have that value and have the magic from that. And so it is a beautiful kind of combination of a difficult terrain that then influences the people and allows them to do interesting things. And it also really affects warfare and aspects like that, which is a focus of the series. Because when you have plains that are broken up and people cannot easily reach different locations, it makes defense really easy, like you were talking about with your cliffs, Larissa. But it also means trade is more difficult. People become separated and isolated from each other. And when people are more isolated, it means that they're less trusting. And so there's a lot of different aspects in there. But he also has aspects where you'll have one side of the world, you'll have the shattered plains, but then areas that are protected by the storm enough can have greenery and actually survive well because of that. And so we can have different areas of our world look different, just like in the real world. We have the Sahara Desert on one side, you've got the Himalayan mountains, you've got the temperate plains of the United States. We also have desert in the United States and aspects like that. So it can be a lot of different aspects that we work into our geography. And so depending on the size of your nation, that can be really easy. Because if it's a small nation, you can say, well, there's mountains. They all live underground. They're in cliffs. That can work out really well. And that can allow you to have a really focused, unique perspective on that. But it can also allow you to have divides within your nation. If people live in different areas, they might have different ways of living, different focuses on different things, and that affects who they are as people. And the last thing I want to focus on too with the magic system of Stormlight Archive is they have these things called spren that Sanderson, when he writes this, they manifest both emotions and things like fire or elements like that as these living creatures in what's called the cognitive realm, which is like parallel world to ours. I won't go into all of it because it is fairly complex, but it shows that you can do really interesting magic systems where you make things literally come to life as a way of doing things versus just being little wisps of magic, because both can be cool. So next interaction is talking about, let's talk about then the geography of the world. I know some of you guys have already done aspects of this and begun thinking of it, but think about the differences we have throughout our world. We've got cityscapes, we've got the forests, you have hills, you have massive cliffs on the side of oceans. How can all of these influence how we think about the world? And I know you can't be able to do all of this right now, but when we think about it and we create maps for our worlds, we start to understand how that world's laid out. These are all things you need to consider, because one thing a lot of fantasy shows and movies and books run into is it just seems to be like 200 miles of forest with nothing in between it besides a couple of villages and like a river occasionally, which is the most boring terrain you think you could ever think of, because that's not how the world works. If you go out for a hike, there's no just flat mountain like forest anywhere. Usually there's at least some little ridges and things like that. There's a crevice where creatures are hiding. There is occasionally like little hills. And so you think about how even the smallest elements of your world can affect the people, and how the terrain affects what resources people have. Are they farming? Are they, woodsmen? Do they have to rely on hunting? Can they fish? All things like that then form a culture, because it shows the difference between, if you think about like Greenland and how they survive by fishing or things like that, barely struggle to expand, versus a resource-rich nation such as the Germans in the Middle Ages, where there was so many, you could have different, really small countries that were all connected, or little principalities, because there's a lot of resource richness. You had arable terrain, you could farm easily, and that makes a big difference for how powerful a culture is going to be. because if you don't have a ton of resources, it's hard to expand. And so it might be a big difference between, I'm going to go back to your focus on the wolves in this world. Maybe the wolves are, they're carnivores, right? Maybe their terrain is difficult. They've eaten a lot of the herbivores in their area, and that's maybe why they're trying to invade the dwarves. Maybe they're trying to get the magic from the wizards, because the wizards somehow can bring life back to their landscape that they've destroyed or something like that. So you can think about things of why people need things from other people, because they might have resources that you don't have. And there's two ways typically to get resources: trade, or you can get it through warfare, unfortunately, or sharing. I mean, sharing tends to work really well too, but unfortunately, cultures have been really bad about that historically. And so we can think about those aspects and how that terrain affects how those cultures are going to survive. Do we have any questions while I'm on this? Great. Okay, before I get to Star Wars real quick, I can talk a little bit about one more inspiration from my books that kind of might help you think of some other aspects of how geography can affect. I have a culture within my Realm Reacher series called the Vakans, which are the second of the Commonwealth of Two Nations. They actually tamed ibexes and kind of bred them like we have bred horses historically, because ibexes, they live in the mountains, and ibexes are very good at climbing mountains. And horses would be fairly useless to them. So you can think about, I have a fun thing where then they ride ibexes around. So you have these little things that make it unique, because people live in mountains, they live in valleys, they live in stuff. And you think historically why people did things in our world. Is that relevant to your world, like horses? Or is it have to be different because they never would have done that thing because they didn't have valleys or flatlands to use horses and things like that? So that was just a fun element to bring in there. Star Wars. So Star Wars also has a very, very fun system. I'm going to focus a little bit on the economics and politics of Star Wars, because these are kind of the two last things I'm going to have us focus on with our interactions. Star Wars has a really interesting system hidden within a really basic system. It seems at first that it's just the rebels versus the Empire. The Empire is the bad guys, the rebels are the good guys. But the deeper you go into Star Wars, you realize how much interesting aspects go into it. There's so much real world inspiration between Star Wars. I have to go through this full list because I was looking up and like, wow, there were a lot of inspirations. Clearly, there's a lot of inspirations from the Empire being inspired by the Nazis. Palpatine himself, the emperor, is actually inspired by Richard Nixon, though, which was a kind of funny thing for me to research. Apparently, that way Richard Nixon was his inspiration for Palpatine. So I guess we know how he feels about Nixon. But you think about the Vietnam War inspired the Rebel Alliance with this kind of small scale warfare defending against a much more powerful empire. There's a lot of Roman naming, so that inspired some aspects of it. And then the Jedi themselves take inspiration from kind of Knights Templar and samurai culture as well. But they also take on a really, really powerful thing that we think about clothing and we think about weaponry and aspects like that. You can look at a single person in Star Wars and tell if they're the good guy or the bad guy, because Darth Vader is wearing black with a red lightsaber, bad guy. Luke Skywalker is wearing white and a blue lightsaber, good guy. Very overly simplistic, but it shows how really simple imagery can sometimes show you what the good guys are or what the bad guys are. And you can show in your culture the same way. If someone's dressed in a particular color they don't wear in your culture or something like that, they can say, oh, this guy's from that place. We don't like those people. Or they have a certain type of weaponry that we don't have. And little things like that can add a lot of depth just by like changing a color or making certain colors associated with certain groups. Like I said in my Realm Reacher series, the Crimson Court, which is the main bad guys, don't openly wear crimson, but in silent and like their collective meetings they do. But when they become more powerful, they start to wear it in the open, and that becomes a symbol then of authority. So how do you can use those kind of attire for a government type of aspect for things as well to show influence? Their Senate as well seems like pretty basic Senate, right? That they vote on things. It's corrupt. sounds pretty familiar. But the Senate is really interesting because they have one representative from every planet, no matter how many people it is. So kind of like our Senate, but it's both massive and it evolves into the empire at some point, but the Senate still exists. And if you've watched the show Andor, which I highly recommend, which is a follow-up show to a lot of Star Wars, it shows how some representatives from the Senate, even during the imperial period, were trying to resist the empire from within. How can you think then, in your system, do you have a corrupt nation? Do you have a very nice nation? But how do these people then, within their system, operate to either work in favor of it, work against it? And remember, like I said earlier, that there's always different factions within a nation that are trying to push things one way or the other. Think about lobbyists, different political parties, aspects like that. And can they succeed, or are they really fighting a hopeless battle like Mon Mothma was in Andor, where she's trying to speak out against the Empire, but effectively the Empire had already won? And the last aspect of it is things like how does the technology, how does your magic, all that affect the economics? Think about Star Wars. We've got droids, which take a very, very different feel than what like modern AI seems to be taking when we look at things. The droids in Star Wars seem like these really funny, they're like comic relief almost, but they're also like effectively, if you think of them like there's a just funny debate in Star Wars where they almost act like slave labor because they almost seem cognizant. They almost seem like they have their minds, but they're unpaid. They're forced to do labor. They're just kind of the funny guys, and they die all the time. So it becomes this interesting thing of how does that affect the economics of the world? Where Star Wars doesn't try to too much go into the depth of like the morality of some of this and like the unemployment that causes stuff. But it's really interesting to show how you can also focus on aspects that could be really dark, but make them some of the funniest, most lighthearted aspects of it too, if you choose to show it in a different way. Like we all love droids like R2-D2 and stuff like that. But so that's all fun stuff that Star Wars that comes into play. And I've talked actually a lot about this, so I won't cover too much about my own research stuff with the politics. But my inspirations with the real world for this one was similarly to Star Wars. There were some inspirations like Nazism, fascism, and stuff. But with the actual Polish history, there was a group they called the Szlachta, which was the nobility in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They thought that they were a different race than the peasantry, but they weren't. They claimed that they were superior in some way because of that. So I said, what if there actually was? What if there was like a magic system that only the magic users, the scions, were the ones ruling then, and they had authority as the nobility? I took the inspiration as well as they elected the king. They didn't just have the king be appointed. It's not just the king's eldest son kind of a thing. But that meant the noble houses that were all really powerful and competing with each other would often elect a foreign king instead of the king of their own nation. They would like elect some random French dude because they would rather have a king that was basically useless than have a rival take power. And that could be a thing we look at and study in our thing, saying, what is the advantages of that? What's the disadvantages of that? Because it was the most Republican type of system that you would have, besides like the United States, and like, well, actually the United States didn't exist yet, like the 1600s. But it was also fairly oppressive and didn't work because it allowed other countries then to influence them. So it could be fun ways you look at that, and that influenced how I kind of came up with the stuff with that. And I've talked a lot basically about the other influences, but I also say you can mix genres and bring in how technology affects stuff with like, I have a Polish kind of inspired, there's a big thing in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth called the Winged Hussars, which were a cavalry force that were major influence of power. I said, okay, how can I take that aesthetic and then mix it with some like little steampunk elements where I have one of my main characters has kind of like a steam powered prosthetic leg. And so you can kind of mix aesthetics with both real world stuff and your own ideas. All right, so the last interactive we've got here is focusing on government and the economy, kind of like what I talked about before, Star Wars, but now with our own ideas. We've got in our worlds, we've set up kind of the aesthetic of the nation, what the magic system is, what the technology level is. Now, how is this country operating? Because it can be a lot of fun to come up with like how beautiful the world is, what the people are like, what they're wearing. But how do they get food? How do they stop from dying from diseases or not stop dying from diseases? Because that can be a problem too. Do they have equality based off of everything from different culture, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, etc.? How is there, because they kind of have complete equality, but that would be an amazing accomplishment that we've actually never seen in history, which can be an interesting point to talk about by itself. But if there are certain groups that are excluded or put down, why is that? And is there a struggle against that? Is there not a struggle against that? And how does that work out? Who's the leader, if any leader? Because they could have a system that there's no one particular leader, or they could have one where it's a matriarchy or a patriarchy or a oligarchy, or there's a million different political systems that we can come up with. And it can be fluid or static. You can have one ruler for a long time, or you can have many rulers for short periods. And then how does those rulers affect that economic system as well? We said, all right, they get fed, whether it's from agriculture or fish or something like that. Are they taxed for that? Does it make it hard for the peasants to survive? Which is a very, very big major part of historical revolutions. Was the king wanted his money, the nobility, he taxed the nobility, needed to survive or wanted their money, so they taxed the peasants. Peasants don't have any money, they rise up and kill the king. Does that cause a strain in your world, or is there a way that the king or other groups have managed to have more ease of living for people? Does the magic affect that? Do you have a magic that allows it easier to create food? Or is it one that actually puts a strain on the resources because it helps them try to expand? And do these external threats, you're talking about whether it's the wolves or the other people in your cliff-like culture that affect the government and economy of a system of these people? If there is a threat from elsewhere, people tend to become more authoritarian. There tends to be a economy that's focused less on trade and focused more on like internal focus and isolationism. How does that affect the culture? And those are all things you can look at as well, because it's really hard to have a really easy, nice system of government without a core leader or anything like that if you're not being invaded. But if those wolves or whatever are coming, well, who's telling the army what to do? Who's ensuring that they have swords and shields and weaponry and everything like that to make sure that they can hold off whoever's attacking them? While in times of peace, it could be great to have a more simple system of government that allows for free discussion, advancement of rights, things like that. And we look at actual history has shown us that, unfortunately, those two things, war tends to cause the opposite, and peace tends to cause advancement of those things. I'll give everyone a little bit of a moment to talk about that. We were just talking about, with our world, writing the government and the economy. Go ahead.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So, like, with my village of dwarves, I kind of made their government kind of like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Where it's like you have this happy, joyful people who know no evil, and then all of a sudden evil gets introduced to them.
Yep.
And I guess my question that I'm trying to form is how do you incorporate or name a type of government where it's everyone's like happy? Would you call it a utopia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the people online, the question is, he has a culture of dwarves that have never met evil before or really been threatened from outside, right? And so does that what kind of government does that look like? How are the people in that? So yeah, you think about the Hobbit. Let's use your example. You think about the Hobbits from Lord of the Ring, right? There's no real government in the Shire, right? There's effectively the it's effectively an anarchy. I mean, there is no government effectively. Is there a mayor? So okay, there's in my defense, I'm not great at my Lord of the Rings lore. So there is a mayor. So we have a local representative that spoilers, Samwise becomes the mayor. Okay. So is it the mayor of all of like the Shire, or is it just of Hobbiton? Okay, so there might be some type of structure, but we see it's a very, very lax system of government. There's not a military. I haven't seen any form of taxation or something. I don't know. There's something. So you can have different types of forms of government. It doesn't really matter too much what you want to call it, because it's very rare in a book where they're like, we're a republic. It's like you can show people getting elected or that there's a mayor, and people are like, oh, cool, it's a republic. They were voted. Like you can like so. I mean, but there are different ways of it. So if you have like a peaceful group of people, think about if history. Then let's think about some cultures in our history that have had unfortunate tragedies that have existed without in a fairly peaceful environment and then met an attacking force. Colonialism is a fairly accurate example. So you think about, let's like not even think about like Native Americans where there was like still a lot more interaction between tribes and stuff. But let's think of like some more isolated nations that were like on islands that were very like one tribe. So we still, I mean, some of these islands still exist, and you can see that a lot of times there is a more. It's largely a communal culture, whether they want to call it communism or tribalism or whatever. When there's not a threat from outside, there tends to be people just working together because there's not. Someone's going to take the thing from me. Because when there's a threat where someone's going to take something from you, whether it's aggressive, whether it's, you think about in our system where, well, if I don't pay my bills, someone's going to take my house from me, type of thing. That tends to make you like, you have to like work harder for something, advance for something, or like become defensive. And so we see cultures that were more isolated. They tend to be a little bit more peaceful, don't have as much like focus and need for a military advancement. You don't see them rolling around with tanks and stuff like that, though, you know, resources come to play in that. So it is a thought experiment to play in if your world, how is that culture adapt to not having a threat from outside? And how does that then change them? Hobbiton would have been completely destroyed if they weren't helped by an exterior force, right? And unfortunately, you look at a lot of our history, a lot of these cultures were destroyed in horrible ways. So you think you have, I'm really bad at my Lord of the Rings nations, Gondor. You have Gondor, you've got the Rohan, and then you've got like Gandalf and the magic. Yeah, well, oh yeah, the elves are kind of important, but the dwarves are kind of doing, I mean, they kind of got screwed over real quick at the start there. But that was the thing with the dwarves too. They had a really defensive structure. They didn't tend to care about the other cultures around them because the dwarves were focused on a defensive, isolationist type of system. They had a lot of resources, so they didn't need other people. Gondor, Rohan, there was a lot more interaction because they lost space. There's not a ton of like heavy, dense mining that they're doing, so they don't have all the riches that the dwarves can kind of rely on themselves. So you can have a culture where like the dwarves were, where they necessarily weren't under threat, and so they're just so focused on like enriching themselves, or they can focus on the arts, or you can focus. So it all depends on what your culture values, and that's a big thing too. Is in peacetime we go after what we value. If you imagine just even in people's personal lives, you can think of like war as like any type of conflict people have in their life. If you take away having to do work or doing anything really you don't want to do, what would you pursue in your life? That is what you value. So like some people would go play video games, or other people would play basketball, other people would write. That's what they value. Think about the same thing just on a cultural level. A culture that really values the arts might focus on theater, or they might focus on, you think about like ancient Greece. There was a lot of both militarism at times, but there was also focus on like theatrical elements. But then there's also cultures that they are peaceful, or they don't have a threat from the other side, but they become the threat to other people. Sometimes that is because they lack a resource. Other times it's just because their culture decides that's what they want to value and go after it. So there is a common, what I'd say is everything has a cause that goes to the conclusion. So your people are peaceful. They've never seen evil. Therefore, they don't know how to stop evil. So they're not building a lot of different weaponry or things like that. Which means you said that they had earlier that they had stone defenses and wood.
Yeah.
I think a big thing to think of then is, would they have even developed those things? Or are those things just to like stop against, they were attacked by like wolves or something like that? Not that that's actually happened all that much in history. It's over exaggerated. I wasn't thinking of the actual wolves. I meant the non-sentient wolves.
Right.
But it could be a thing where you think about a lot of like peasantry and stuff, and a lot of history is that the army was actually just a bunch of dudes in farming tools, kind of stacked up in a line, and then there were some knights that actually had armor. So is this defense that they have against your actual wolves that are attacking? Is it just they're mining tools and they were using like stone and stuff like that as a protective because they were in like a harsh environment that when you're doing the labor you need to accomplish, that you're just utilizing that now for warfare, which is actually a lot of how history came about. So that's all things to think about with that, because yeah, the real world, most people, it's not the Middle Ages, wasn't actually a bunch of dudes in heavy armor facing off. It was like 10 guys in heavy armor and about like 2,000 guys with sticks and like maybe a shield, and then they stood in rows and poked at each other. They don't show that in movies because it's not as cinematic. But it makes it, you can add a realism by saying, okay, are they using farming equipment, mining equipment if they're in the mountains, things like that. So I just rambled for a long time at you, but there's a lot of things to think about because of a culture that hasn't seen evil is going to be very, very different than even like an average culture that has kind of a threat from occasionally from outside. They're going to be very vulnerable because they don't know how to stop it. So, yeah. Any other questions online? Great. So I think we already talked about my last thing about appropriation. I already kind of rambled about that a bit. So yeah, treating people with respect, all that kind of thing, especially if someone like me has to take that very seriously because I am like a white, straight, male, obviously privileged background. So when I'm writing about minorities, I really want to make sure that I treat people with respect and know that I'm coming from a place of privilege when I'm doing my writing. But I want to do, if anyone's kind of put together kind of the things and wants to share a little bit, we can do a little bit of sharing before we finish. Have you come up with anything else you want to share, or anyone else?
Yeah, I think I've shared way too much.
That's okay. Did you guys want to share it all? It's okay. I think this was to say, yeah, no pressure at all. One of the things in, like I said, with world building is this process. We have the freedom to be as conservative to ourselves about it or sharing as possible. The first draft of anything is for you as a creator, and it's not until you're ready to share it that you need to share it. So that's okay.
I tend to go in fits and starts.
Yeah.
I'll have long gaps where I'm not accomplishing anything. How do you that momentum?
That's a great question. For those online, she said that she goes in fits and starts of writing and just writing or creating in general. Yeah. Okay. And then how do you keep more consistent with it? So it's a great question. It's something that every writer has to war with. I am ADHD, so it is something that I have to deal with, trying to deal with, because it's really easy to write when you're inspired, right? When you're like, I've got the ideas flowing out of my head. They're just going onto the page. It feels wonderful. You can write pages and pages without even thinking it's 2 a.m. and you're like, wow, I haven't gone to the bathroom for 4 hours. ADHD things. Anyway, what was I say? So there are two things, or a few things here. First, unfortunately, there's just a level of discipline where you said, I have to say, like, I'm not full-time as an author yet, but I kind of consider it a part-time job. So I say at the end of every day, I'm going to give, I look at my schedule and say from 7 to 9 o'clock, I'm writing. I'm putting myself in the chair. I'm turning off my phone or like just not looking at it. And I'm just writing or doing research or something that's related to productivity. Because if you want it to be a job, you got to treat it like a job. If you want it to be a hobby, you can finish whenever you want. But consistency is key. And I think one of the big things is once you get in the habit of doing it, it makes it a lot easier. One thing I find that's really effective for me is I learned from an author named Brian Cahill that is, I say, like I said, I was saying, I'm going to write from 7 to 9, or even if it's 30 minutes, pick a time period that you think you can sit in that chair and not move for 30 minutes or something like that. But I say I'm going to write for 2 hours. Because I'm ADHD, I know that there's going to be a point where I'm like, I need to check my phone or get up or do something just because I'm going to get distracted. So I build in my phone saying I'm going to write for that 30 minutes of the 2 hours, give myself a 5 to 10 minute break, do whatever I want in that 5 to 10 minutes, then sit down again, do another 30 minutes. Because I can like peg my distractions to that 5, 10 minutes from like, I could go, yeah. And then I can say, I'm going to go do the laundry or something like that real quick. And that also gives me a chance, I found while I'm writing, that it gives me a chance that while I'm doing something else, my back of my head's kind of working on what I'm going to write next. And it actually makes it really easy when I sit down again to say, all right. Yeah. And so like now I'm excited to sit down again. I'm not tired about it. I'm like excited to keep writing. Another thing I recommend that if you like, you're like, I wrote something and now I don't want to go back to it and keep writing, is don't stop at the end of a chapter. Don't stop even at the end of a paragraph. One thing people say is stop in the middle of a sentence, even sometimes, because it's almost like you're forcing yourself to stop mid-thought. And we have this inherent desire that we want things to be finished. And so even if you can't do it now, you're going to have that desire to come back to it later. And you've already had then that thought in your head saying what I was going to do to finish that sentence. And your brain inherently is then like, all right, what's coming after that? And so it just makes it easier to carry that momentum. Because the worst thing is staring down at the sheet of paper and saying, all right, chapter 2. Now what? It's easier to go with some momentum. So that's my thing, is never finish at the end of an actual chapter. I need to follow this advice more often because I sometimes will just like, oh, I'm done with that chapter. I'm bored. I'm going to go do something else. But then you need to at least write a little bit because it'll just allows you to have that momentum. Yeah, besides that, discipline just inherently comes in some of it. And reward yourself with something that you like if you reach your word count goal or whatever thing like that. Like if I get X number of pages written, I get to have a cookie. It sounds stupid, but one thing I like, we always say is like gamify things. And this can be good for any task you don't want to do in your life. Is saying like in video games, if you complete any task, stupid little side quest or something like that, you get experience points, a little bit of gold, whatever. Do that in your real life. Just say like, all right, if I complete this, I get to have do this other thing I want to do. And if I don't do this, I can't do my fun little other thing. So it inspires me to actually get the thing done so I can do what I want to. Yeah, writer's block and not wanting to do things is inherently part of that. And world building comes into it, because one thing I find that it's easy to get trapped in world building, or just if you don't have enough world building, it can be hard to continue writing, because you say, I need to write that bit, but I don't know like what that room looks like or who's going to be in that or stuff like that. If you could even just like jot that down ahead of time, do a little bit of thought outside of it, even if you're like waiting in the line at Meijer or something like that, and you're just like, oh, I need to put that on my phone. I find that helps me then get the momentum later.
I think it helps you to let go of the fact that if you sit down to write something, it has to be good.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Your first, that is an excellent point, and it is one thing. I'm 14 books in. I still struggle with that very point, that what we write the first time has to be good, because actually, with the more experienced I've gotten, the more harsh I am on myself on the first draft. The first draft is for you. It is you telling yourself the story, especially if you haven't outlined. that's you telling you what happens. You are just writing out what happens. It doesn't have to be good because no one needs to ever look at that. Because beta readers or like editors and stuff don't look at the first draft. They look at the 5th draft or the 8th draft or the 115th draft. Hopefully you don't go that far. But it allows you to, that takes that weight off, I think is what you're saying, is when you're writing, you're like, oh no, what if this is horrible? That's okay if the first draft's horrible. Most first drafts are horrible. Your first draft will get a little bit better of everything you write because it's practice. And like anything, you don't get better unless you practice. And so, yeah, take that pressure on. Just say like, I'm telling myself a story, and then I can change it later, no matter how I want. You can change the entire story if you want. You can change the character's first name. You can change what country they live in. You can change any aspect of it. I have one thing. I'm currently working on a series that's attached to my Realm Reacher series, and that was in the spirit realm. This one's in the death realm. So I have undead characters, all this kind of stuff. It's an unfamiliar aspect to me as an author. So I'm reworking stuff more often than I normally would on a first draft, but I'm only doing it because I'm an experienced author and I know that it's just going to make the rest of my writing easier if I've like figured out the aspects that I was struggling with. One thing I tend to do though is I have on my phone I'm actually on the notes app. I talked about like in Meyer lines or things like that, just jotting down notes. I have just this list of just thoughts. I will never look at most of these again, but most of these are like I jot it down and I go home when I'm going to write it next and I look down what I jotted down recently, and I just don't delete them because I just leave them as old thoughts. And then I'll just kind of look at it and say, oh yeah, and it'll just give me a little bit of nugget of thought to continue off. But that also what I'll do is I have some of those ongoing notes. I plan to go back and change when I finish the first draft. So what I'll do is say, all right, I'm going to write this full draft and not go back and change. Like, oh man, I need this dude to have a sword in this scene to be able to stab this dude, but he doesn't have one. Well, I don't need to go back and rewrite the full scene before this to give him a sword or something like that. I can just jot down on my note and say, at this point, this guy doesn't need to do this. Because then when you're going through the second draft, you don't have to it doesn't take you forever to get through the first draft. Just when you're doing a second draft and just doing a quick read through at first and saying, what have I written? You can say, all right, I needed to do these quick changes. And it makes it feel a lot more approachable than the mountain the editing can feel like. Then you're saying like, I already know most of what I need to edit, instead of saying I need to edit every phrase to make it feel like it's the best thing ever. So yes, that's my recommendation.
There's a question here in the chat.
Yep. That's an excellent question. That's really difficult. So that part of the reason I did the stuff I did on my website was, so I did a thing called Slavic Saturday where that 72 blog articles, because so much of it is not in English on the internet. It is a lot of it's in like Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Serbian, whatever. And so there's a few great websites. I mean, if you want some really basic stuff, you can just go to my website, brendan-noble.com. I would actually just search Brendan on Google, whatever. Just search Brendan Noble Slavic Saturday. I have a whole page that just has every article I've written about the different gods, demons, whatever. And I'm always happy to answer any questions. But there's another guy. His name's I don't remember the exact one. His name's like Lamis Dvorsky. He has an excellent page out there that's really accessible. There's some books. The books are hit or miss, because one problem about Slavic mythology is it's super regional. You think about a lot of mythologies, you think about it's just like the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts. They were like one specific nation. Slavs were like are split between like 15 different countries. And so the Russians, the Polish, the Ukrainians, the Serbians, the Croatians all have different mythologies and languages and stuff like that. Don't tell you it's the same, even though some of them can actually talk to each other. There's been obvious divides historically over stuff like that. And that means that wherever you talk to or research, there's going to be a focus on one of the mythologies or one of the countries. My focus tends to be on the Polish side of things. There's other people that focus on the Russian or the Ukrainian or the Serbian side of things. So just think about that when you go into it. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have some fantastic resources. besides, if you want to check out some easy ones, my website, there are some decent books out there, but one thing I wish I did better was writing down a lot of the sources that I had like originally used for my books, because I just kind of compiled things from all over the place. And then I realized, oh, other people want some of this, and I just didn't. I have another friend. Her name is Alex Kujawa, AlexKujawa. She is an artist on Instagram who she does these little art books that are like 30 different Slavic demons, or like 30 cats from folklore and stuff like that. And she's Polish, so that she has a lot of like really fun insights that she puts in these little art books in her art on Instagram and stuff. So that could be a nice, easy way to start too. So. Yeah, that's one big thing, because like I confess that was one of my first things I struggled with when I first started writing too. My wife, she's my alpha reader, I'll jokingly call her. She always said, "What are they wearing in this scene?" When I was first, like my first, like my Prism Files series, like half the time I'd be like, they're like clothes. I don't know, like I didn't describe what they were wearing very often. It's gotten more fun as I work into it, because creativity can come into so much. Like that's the great thing of fantasy. You can leverage some things with the real world inspirations, but you can just mash things together and say stuff and just do roll of cool sometimes and say like, what's fun?
What is your editing process?
Yeah, editing process is an interesting thing. Every author is going to have a different answer for you on this. Mine is, so I finished the first draft, and then it really depends. Like when you finish a book, you kind of have you've got either two feelings. You're like, this is the greatest thing ever, or it's the worst thing ever. And I've never felt a feeling in between those two things. And you're usually wrong both times. It's somewhere in the middle. And so my process is I finish the first draft. Like I said, I take those notes throughout and I say, I know I need to make at least these changes of the notes that I've taken throughout. So I go through my first edit is going through that first draft. I am reading the full book, but I tend to be focusing on what elements that I focus on in my notes that I need to improve. I know right now. And so I'm focusing on those. And I might even just take a pass on one of the elements if they're a big element, such as like, I need this to be more tense or more funny or something like that. And so I'll kind of just, because you're going to read your book many times, but that's what I'll probably focus on the first time. Do not focus on grammar and like spelling and stuff like that all that much early on. If you catch something, fix it. But that's for editing and beta reading and the last proofreading processes. Really focus on what does the plot need in its first, on your first edits. What do the characters need? And is there massive plot holes or things like that? Because plot holes are pretty important, and catch them early because they're very hard to fix later in the process. So change things when it's the most moldable. So I usually go through a few phases of that. So I do the ones on my notes, and once I've gone through that second draft, I'll have some of the ideas of other things I need to fix, because all right, well, I read through it. Now I've read the book as a reader, not just over months of writing. And now I'm like, okay, I know what I'm missing. I'll do another pass. So usually I have 2 or 3 main editing passes before I get to like my last like grammar checks, which I use an app called Pro Writing Aid, which is kind of like Grammarly, but a little bit more advanced, where they'll focus on a bunch of other elements. Like it could say if you repeated things in a chapter, or like you use this word like a million times, because we all have crutch words. Mine was slightly for a long time, and then what was the other one? Battered. It was just like everything battered people. It was like the wind battered them. They got battered by this. We don't realize what we use until we use like get editors or stuff like that to help. So once I've done that last kind of grammar check by myself, there's kind of 2 things you can do. I definitely have beta readers, even if you don't have a huge budget. Beta readers you can do for free. Those are people that are friends who are willing to be honest with you and tell you if it sucks. or family, and people that read your genre. Those are two key things, because if they're not honest with you, it's useless, because they're just going to tell you this is great, and that's not useful feedback. But if they are willing to be honest with you and the people that read your genre, then they actually know what's good in your genre too. Because if they're willing to be honest with you, but they don't read your genre, they might think it sucks. But if they only read romance and you read fantasy, they're like, there's too many dragons in this. Well, maybe there are, but if they're not used to that, then it might not work out. But there are also places online where you can find beta readers, ask people for feedback. Reddit's a really good one. There's some Facebook groups. Yep. And you don't need a ton of beta readers. You need like maybe 5 or 6 beta readers. I have very long books that are like 700 pages long and complex now, and I'm advanced enough in my career. I have like 20 beta readers, because I kind of, at this point, anyone who's willing to give, like in my community, who are willing to give me feedback, I'll take it. And then more feedback's better than none on how complex my stuff is. And then once I'm done with the beta readers, they give their feedback. And while they're giving their feedback, I usually start writing another book. Once they give me the feedback, then I'll implement that. Then I give it to my editor, who does like some of the final checkups, and then put it all together and publish it. So that's a good question. So I've had a couple beta readers who have read, that I know personally, and they're more friends that have been around since book 1 of my 14. They're all separate books, like not series, but so there are people that have like seen my growth. They know when it's better and what's worse, and I trust their feedback because I've had them for a long time. There's other ones though that are brand new, and my ask for them is, if you're going to beta read current book, you just have to have read the previous book. And it doesn't need to be you have had read it before you filled out the beta reader form, because I have people fill out a form, because if you don't have them fill out a form, people just sign up and they don't actually put any effort in, or they just steal your book. So it's, at least if you put out a form, they had to like had enough care to like answer 10 questions. But yeah, I just ask, if I give you a free ebook copy of the first book, will you read? Like I had that for the second book. I said, will you read the first one first? And they went, yeah. And so that's what I do, because it depends on your series. For my stuff, like book 2 would make absolutely no sense if you'd had it read book 1 first. So though I did actually have one beta reader who said she would read book 1, and then she didn't read book 1 and then read book 2, and she's like, this could be a standalone. And I'm like, I don't think it could be, but I'll take that as a compliment. And then she's like, I'm gonna go back and read book 1. So in general though, unless it's like one of those romance series where they kind of are connected but they're really not, I would recommend just asking people to read. And if you give them a free copy, they normally will say, yeah, sure, I'll read the first book, you gave me a free book. So the hard thing is when you're on like book 5 of a series and you don't have beta readers, because then they got to read 4 books first. But normally I'd say, well, if you got to book 5 of a series and you don't have beta readers, you should have had beta readers for the first 4. And if you lost all of them, it might have not been good. But you can also just like, there are people that will still read all of them. There are just people too, if you like, can you read this for just grammar? Like, because every beta reader, I don't tell them what to focus on, because that's why I get a ton, because some are going to tell me every grammar mistake I made, which is great. Other ones will tell you, even though some of them are wrong, but that's okay. They'll tell you what they think for the characters or the romances. It's like everyone reads for something different, and you don't want to direct them, except if you want like specific questions on certain things, towards it, because that gives you a feedback from like average readers on like all different types of areas. And then I give a form to them at the end and say, all right, I got their notes, because I ask them to take notes throughout the entire book. They highlight things I think are funny or bad or whatever. And then I have like questions at the end and say, like, specifically, I need to know, did these things work? Like I'll ask about like a character's relationships, growth, magic. Did it make sense?
Did you ever try to go traditional publishing route?
I was indie from the beginning. Yeah, I started writing in end of 2018 with NaNoWriMo, it's National Novel Writing Month. My wife kind of challenged it because she knew I was a daydreamer. She's like, you would enjoy writing. I'm like, all right, let's try it. And then I had a ton of fun with it. I'm not like I was an economics major and a data analyst my day job. I didn't take creative writing. But it really just, it was a bug that caught me and I hit it off. But when I started doing that and was reaching the end of that first book, I was like, well, now what do I do with this? I didn't know anything about publishing. And so when I done my research, there was a group that's still around called Self-Publishing Formula. I think they're called the Self-Publishing Show now. And they talk about, how to self-publish, what's the process, stuff like that. And there are other people in a lot of these Facebook groups you can join. It's like the only reason I'm really on Facebook besides my Facebook page is there's a lot of groups for authors that are excellent for just learning from people. And they taught me about the process. And then a lot of them will openly tell you their stories about them attempting to traditionally publish. And I, again, knowing at the time, I didn't know I was ADHD, but I did know I would give up if I had to take 100 rejections to queries. Yeah. And so I like, while I do have a thick skin, I think I would have gotten impatient. And so I've made mistakes with self-publishing over times. Like you're like, oh, I would have done this better or this better, but it's a learning process. Your writing is not one book. It's however you want, progress. It depends. If you want to write one book, I understand that's a whole different approach. But yeah, I went self-publishing from the start because I knew, one, I want creative control. I love being able to do the art. I showed throughout this presentation for my series, I get to work with incredible artists. I get to do Kickstarters for all my stuff. I can price books however I want. I don't have a publisher putting whatever they want on the cover, which is sometimes bad because authors have no say usually on what the cover is. So there is a lot of advantages to it. I've talked to like Brandon Sanderson, probably biggest epic fantasy author right now. And he's even said if he started now, he would probably be self-publishing and he is kind of self-publishing some stuff, but because the traditional publishing industry used to be like your golden egg. If you got into it, you were like set. But nowadays, marketing is so much like they expect still traditional published authors to do their own marketing. You might be in Barnes and Noble and bookstores, but we can get in. I'm in a bunch of indie bookstores. I'm in some libraries. I'm on every platform I want because you can be either like just on Kindle Unlimited and Kindle, or you can be wide on basically every retailer. So basically, indie can do almost everything that trad does. So if you do it right and treat it like a business, you can. It is a lot of work, though. I won't deny that. But the great thing is there are so many people that will know that I don't know a single author that would say no to giving advice to people on publishing or writing. We were all at positions any of you guys are at wanting to write or publish, and we want to kind of send the ladder down that we kind of had to like clamber up a more difficult way, or people helped us up and we want to help you up. So yep. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, it was those things. I can ramble about writing at any time. We all love. I mean, to become an author, like I said, 14 books, you gotta love what you're doing. And it's really fun experience to get to talk to new authors and see people coming up with ideas and stuff.
How do you organize?
Oh man, I should have talked about a world. That's a great idea. It's a great thought. So everyone does this differently, but we call it a story Bible. Because everyone does this differently. I'll create a Google Drive usually, or whatever folder structure, and I have like folders kind of specifically for like characters, where it's like here's their character, and I just literally when I do it, if I outlined ahead of time, I'll have a bunch of details on like height, weight, hair color, skin tone, all those kinds of things, magic, all those things. And then when I write something and like introduce that character as their first, like normally, when you introduce a character, a lot of times it's like, here's 3 sentences about that character. So that way you know what they look like. I'll copy and paste that into my story Bible. So I know exactly what I described them like for reference. There's that. I'll have like so usually I'll have documents that basically I've just built out on that topic. Like I have one for magic. You can do, I did like an Excel sheet of like, this is the magic with this. Here's what people can do with it. Here's the cost of it, that kind of thing. But everyone does it differently. Most of us have a half jumbled system that is trying to collect everything we can, and then we forget we didn't put everything in there properly. So there's no 100% way to do it. Some people even go as far as there's places like I think it's StoryForge or Campfire. Yeah, StoryForge and Campfire I think are two that both do this, where you can almost create like your own wiki page for your like Wikipedia for your world. So you could create like a wiki page for each of your characters in it, and so that collects all the information there. One that you can make that public later if you want, but it also allows you to like, you can keep it private and just collect your information that way. I'm not organized enough to do that. I probably should. I've considered doing it, but I just have like a really long, like my Realm Reachers story Bible is like largely 2 sheets. One of them is 50 pages long. And like the mythology one I had first, the Slavic mythology one, I just took all my notes from Slavic mythology, and that's my story Bible, and I was just pulling from that from different demons and gods and stuff. So the hard thing is just consistency and making sure that like making sure you know what the character's eye color is, because the worst thing in the world is you're on book 4 of the series and going, I never wrote down what eye color this guy has, and I have to find it, because you can't just like control F brown, because you probably used it multiple times, or like blue, and just try to find where it is, because we all get creative and you don't just say they had blue eyes. It's like they had the color of the eyes of the sea or something like that. And so yeah, that's difficult. Just make sure whatever it is, write it down in whatever way you can, that you can, in a searchable format that you can find later. Because if you can't control F, find it later, it's useless. Oh, that's a great question. So I do make my maps myself. There are also people out there who can make a map for like a couple $100, which is, compared to a lot of art rates, pretty affordable. I use Inkarnate, Inkarnate. They have a free one, but I recommend the premium one. It's like $5 to $10 a month, or you can just buy it for like 1 month or something if you're just doing it for that. It has like all of the like symbols you can put over like towers or whatever. I used it for it's oh. I used it for my three main maps on my books. I also, this book has, I go overwhelming with some of my books, but like, yeah, I do like these with that. And then I even have like battle maps because I'm a nerd. And then I'll even do like battle maps and stuff like that. And so I put every house on my city map. It really doesn't want to load those, does it? That's okay. They're high-res images, and that's probably the problem. Because I was an idiot and just dropped them in there. But yeah, Incarnate's really good. They allow like layering and stuff, and there's some great tutorials. I wish there were some more easier apps out there for map making, because creating like a realistic background of like the textured kind of aspect of things is dang near impossible, or it takes like hours. I probably put like 10 hours into each of my maps. Well, 10 hours minimum, and then I'm a nerd again, so I go and add way too many details and all that fun stuff. It's okay. There was just one of the maps. Oh, yeah, you can do that. My website also has a contact page on it if you ever have any questions. It's got all my, I have a page on my website called resources and maps and stuff. And if you ever want to see all my art and maps and things I put together, it's my world building that's there. That's okay. That's okay. So yeah. Were there any last call questions in there? What is that? Sounds good. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it. I hope whether you use this world or not, a nation or not, that you guys will help create, that you can use the creativity of things you learned for some fun projects.
Thank you very much.
Of course.